Welcome back to Carneades.org. Today we're going to be continuing with our series, Better a Witty Fool, a critique of presuppositionalism. In this video, we're going to be looking at Aristotle versus presuppositionalism. Remembering with this series that we're not actually taking Aristotle's views, but rather an objection inspired by Aristotle to critique and combat the idea of presuppositionalism and the presuppositionalist argument. So first off, who was Aristotle? Aristotle was the teacher of Alexander the Great. He taught Alexander the Great, the famous leader and conqueror, until the age of 16. He was the founder of the Lyceum. Instead of taking over Plato's academy, Aristotle actually went on to start his own famous school of thought, as it were, the Lyceum. He's known as the philosopher, or the first teacher. He's simply called the philosopher by Aquinas, or the first teacher by many Muslim scholars. And importantly for this video, he is the father of logic. He created the field of symbolic logic and the foundations of categorical logic, or at the very least was the principal influence on those fields as we understand them today. Now, logic has changed significantly since Aristotle. Despite the likes of Kant claiming that Aristotle had discovered everything about logic, Frege opened the way for mathematical logic to grow and eventually come integrated with Aristotelian notions of logic, following Russell and Tarski and Gödel and all of those 20th century logicians. As we saw with Kripke, logic continues to change and expand to this day. So the idea that logic doesn't change is an idea that, looking from Aristotle to now, we can see doesn't make any sense. And though he did not name it himself, the compilation of Aristotle's works is called the Organon, meaning the instrument, expressing the idea that logic is simply a tool that we use to determine the validity of arguments. So, back to presuppositionalism. The next question on our kind of dialectic argument is, does logic change? You offer two options: logic changes or logic does not change. If you select logic changes, you're faced with a choice only between logic does not change and logic does not change. The claim here is that while our perception of logic may change, the actual logic does not. And even if it did, that would imply contradictions, and therefore logic does not change. There's a number of concerns with this around the move that keeps being made in this, which is that if logic isn't this, then therefore the law of the excluded middle must be false. Well, it seems that there's a lot of different logics we can have that don't mean the law of the excluded middle is false or that contradictions are fine. Logic seems to be able to change while still including the law of the excluded middle. But that's beside the point for now. What we're going to look at now is kind of an argument for the claim that logic in fact does change. So to say that logic has never changed is like to say that weapons have never changed. While you might say that we started with stones and moved up to swords, then guns, then tanks, then nuclear missiles, the presuppositionalist argument is simply saying that those were just our perceptions of weapons. The real weapons are some underlying thing that all of those have in common or instantiate that hasn't really changed. What are those real underlying weapons that haven't changed? They can't say. Or give a specific description of what that thing is that has not changed. Because, as with logic, if you give any specific description of it, someone can explain, well, actually, that thing evolved from something before it and is going to turn into something later. In the same way you might say with a machine gun, it evolved from something before it and is probably going to change into something 10, 15, 20 years in the future. So saying that that machine gun over time hasn't changed, or the guns that we use or the weapons we use haven't changed over time, doesn't really make sense. And trying to describe something that underlies all those weapons that doesn't change, I don't know what you're talking about. And you require a lot more to explain that there's something that actually is there to explain what that thing is. So let's go to Aristotle's objection. By logic, we either mean one of the tools we currently use to determine the validity of arguments, or we mean something else. If we're referring to our tools, then they are changing every day, and they've changed since the time of Aristotle. And I would argue that that's what most people are talking about when they talk about logic. They're talking about the tools that we use that are changing and improving every single day. Logic is the methods of philosophy. But the presuppositionalists must be referring to something else. To give a charitable interpretation of their argument, they have to be referring to something else other than those tools, because it's clear and obvious that those tools change. But if we're referring to something else, then either what we're referring to is something that is captured by some existent tool of logic, or it's not. Either this real, deeper logic is something that's already in some way instantiated in logic, or it's not instantiated in any logic that we have ever seen at all. If it's captured in some existent logic, then it seems that it must be something that can change, because those logics change all the time. And maybe you would say, well, maybe there's one right logic, and we've captured that one right logic. I don't know. There's convincing arguments for classical and non-classical logic, and all of the logics we have flaws. So saying that any of them are right is a little worrying or concerning. And if it's not captured in some existing logic, then it doesn't seem to exist in any meaningful way. The true logic, we would have no idea what that would look like. Maybe we're doing our best to get to that point, but we have no idea what it would be. And even if that thing may be existing at some point in the future, there's no way for us to say if it changes or not, or if that thing is in some way drastically different than what we conceive of as logic right now, because we know nothing about it. And so to say that, oh, of course it doesn't change, even though I can't tell you a single other thing about it, seems very problematic. So either logic is a changing tool, or it does not exist in any meaningful way. Basically, either we're talking about logic, which we use and which changes, or we're talking about something which we do not use and can't be described and has yet to be discovered or understood. The first case is what most anyone means when talking about logic. The second one just seems to fail to refer. Or even if it does refer to some future state of our logical inquiry, there's no reason for us to believe that that future state isn't a changing one, or it doesn't change with our world around us, or with our understandings. Because there's no argument for that offered other than a blank stare. That was Aristotle versus presuppositionalism. Remember, with all of these arguments, if any single one of these is convincing to you at this point, the presuppositionalist position fails, because every single one of their points has to hit home for them to even get to the premises to begin their argument. Next up, we're going to be taking a look at David Lewis versus presuppositionalism, then St. Thomas Aquinas versus presuppositionalism, and finally, Carneades. I'm going to take a crack at presuppositionalism with hopefully a slew of plenty more arguments. Watch this video and more here at Carneades.org, and stay skeptical, everybody.